Hi, good morning and welcome. I really must say before we start, because I'm not sure you'll hear it at other times during the day, that the power behind this day is Elizabeth Donahue and her staff, and she really deserves a very warm round of applause for the work that she did. In every generation, one or two diplomats rise to the top, and we're fortunate in this colloquium to have the two of my generation. Later on, we'll hear from Ambassador Ryan Crocker, and I have the honor now to introduce Deputy Secretary of State William Burns. Their rising to the top is based not only on good looks, but also on distinguished service, expertise, diplomatic skill, and policy acumen. Bill Burns is emblematic of all of those traits, and that's why we look to him for the diplomatic leadership that he is providing today as he has over the past decades. In addition, he also happens to be a really nice person, and a person I am proud to call a friend for the past 25 years. We lived together and survived diplomatic shuttles, crisis diplomacy, bureaucratic warfare, too many lunches in the State Department cafeteria, secretaries of state who were suspicious of the Foreign Service, special envoys, political appointees, and lots of good times, all with heavy doses of Bill's self-deprecating humor and his very significant personality. Bill is the best of what our country can produce for our top diplomatic posts: smart, reasoned and reasonable, wise, policy savvy, diplomatically skilled, and yet, though I repeat myself, a good friend. He also wrote this introduction, so finally, before his formal bio, I would tell you that he is also the father of Sarah, who is a student here at Princeton, which means that there's evidence of wisdom being transmitted through the generations. Bill's formal bio elaborates this story. He holds the highest rank in the Foreign Service of Career Ambassador, became Deputy Secretary of State in 2011, and he is only the second person who was serving as Deputy Secretary of State as a career diplomat. From 2008 to 2011, Bill was the Undersecretary for Political Affairs. Before that, Ambassador to Russia, Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, Ambassador to Jordan, and a number of other senior posts in the Foreign Service, all of which signify that he was identified at a very early age as a person who was going to be a leader in our diplomatic service. Bill earned his BA in history from LaSalle. That was the choice he always made in the office pool during the NCAA tournament. Never won that office pool, and received his master's and doctoral degrees from Oxford University in International Relations. There's a long list of honors that Bill has earned, including, I think, every one of the State Department's various awards. And I think you have his bio, and if you have about 20 minutes, you can read the list of those honors that are very well deserved. It is a great pleasure and honor and a treat to be able to introduce Bill to you and to welcome him to Princeton. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Susan. It's really nice of you. Well, thank you very much, Dan, and good morning, everyone. I'm not revealing state secrets, but in those NCAA basketball pools, when I picked LaSalle, Dan used to always pick Yeshiva. So neither of us did very well. It truly is an honor for me to be back at Princeton. Sure. I don't know if this is turned on. Is that any better? Okay. It truly is an honor to be back at Princeton and back at the Woodrow Wilson School, an institution whose commitment to public service I've long admired. And it's an honor to be among so many people whose service to our nation I respect so much, from George Mitchell to Ryan Crocker and Barbara Bodine and Ted Kattouf, Rob Malley, Steve Simon, Tammy Wittes. I've been extraordinarily fortunate to serve with all of you, and I've learned a great deal from all of you. and it is truly an honor to be introduced by my friend Dan Kurtzer. There is, quite simply, no better model of skill and professionalism and decency in American diplomacy than Dan Kurtzer. I've been asked this morning to offer a few reflections on American policy across the Middle East in the midst of profound and turbulent change. I promise to be brief, which is probably a very healthy instinct at this hour on a Saturday morning. Whenever I think of the value of brevity in public speaking, I'm reminded of a story that involved the famous author George Bernard Shaw. It seems that Shaw was hosting an event in London one day, and the first speaker came up to him and asked how long he should speak for. And Shaw told him he should probably limit his remarks to about 20 minutes. And the speaker looked at him in horror and said, 20 minutes? How am I supposed to tell them everything I know in 20 minutes? And Shaw paused and replied, in your case, my advice would be to speak very slowly. In my case, you don't have to worry about me going much beyond 20 minutes, even if I speak very slowly. I wish I could also promise to be uplifting, but that's a little harder. The Middle East, as all of you know very well, is a place where pessimists seldom lack for either company or validation, where skeptics hardly ever seem wrong. It's a place where American policymakers often learn humility the hard way, a place where you can most easily see the wisdom in Winston Churchill's famous comment that what he liked most about Americans was that they usually did the right thing in the end. They just like to exhaust all the alternatives first. I've learned a few things about the Middle East during my own checkered 31-year career in the Foreign Service. I've learned that stability is not a static phenomenon, and that regimes which do not offer their citizens a sense of political dignity and economic possibility ultimately become brittle and break. I've learned that change in the Middle East is rarely neat or linear, but often messy and cruel, and deeply unpredictable in its second and third order consequences. I've learned not to underestimate the depth of mistrust of American motives that animates so many people across the region, and I've learned that we often get far more credit than we deserve for complicated conspiracies. I've learned that with all its stubborn dysfunction, the Middle East is a place where people and leaders are capable of great things, and that American diplomacy, with all of our own occasional dysfunction, can make a real and enduring difference. So let me first talk briefly about why the Middle East still matters in American foreign policy and how the Middle East is changing, and then outline several elements of a positive American policy agenda, what we can do to help shape, within the limits of our influence, the great generational struggle between moderation and extremism that is unfolding across the Middle East today. After a post-9/11 decade dominated by two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, it's not hard to see why Americans would seek to rebalance our priorities. We live in a rapidly changing world in which American interests are pulled in many directions. I just returned from a long trip to Asia, and it's obvious that the Asia-Pacific region is not only the most dynamic part of the global economy in the new century which lies ahead, but also a logical centerpiece of American foreign policy. The transformation of the global energy market through the shale technology revolution is also affecting our views of the Middle East. With the U.S. likely to overtake Saudi Arabia as the world's leading oil producer in the next 5 years or so, and with the prospect of genuine energy independence in the next 20 years or so, it's natural to wonder if we really need to pay so much attention to the Middle East. And it is a truism that America's chief foreign policy challenge is domestic renewal, strengthening our homegrown capacity to compete and promote our interests and values around the world. Tempting though it may be, we do not have the luxury of pivoting away from the Middle East, which sometimes has a nasty way of reminding us of its relevance. We don't have the luxury of pivoting away from a part of the world that holds some of our closest allies and a very sizable chunk of the world's oil reserves, on which the global economy is still dependent, even if we are headed toward self-sufficiency. And we don't have the luxury of pivoting away from a part of the world that holds several of the world's most poisonous regional conflicts and violent extremists who feed on the region's bitterness and alienation. We cannot, in short, afford to neglect what's at stake in a region going through its own awakening, at once promising and painful, and potentially every bit as consequential for international order as the changes which swept over Europe and Eurasia 2 decades ago. It's important to understand, I think, that the Arab Awakening is about several layers of change within, among, and beyond Arab states. Within a number of states, the spark produced by a desperate Tunisian vendor, tired of too many indignities and too many lost hopes, proved highly combustible. Within months of that tragic self-immolation, a half-century-old political order collapsed in several Arab states, including Egypt, the biggest of all. Societies that for far too long had known far too little freedom, far too little opportunity, and far too little dignity began to erupt. But what also spilled out, in addition to the thirst of individual citizens for dignity, were all the demons of sectarian and communal tension that authoritarian rulers had forcefully contained. That dynamic, in turn, helped set off new uncertainties and frictions among states in the region, as sectarian troubles and old Sunni-Shia passions spilled across borders still not firmly rooted nearly a century after their post-World War I formation. Meanwhile, beyond Arab states, violent extremist groups were quick to try to fill emerging vacuums and take advantage of post-revolutionary chaos. Non-Arab regional powers like Turkey, Israel, and Iran loomed larger as traditional Arab powers like Egypt turned inward. And major external players like China and India grew even more reliant on access to regional energy supplies. And across this whole shifting landscape, the Arab Awakening stirred up familiar debates about the role of religion in politics, gender equality, individual human rights, and globalization. What all of these layers of change add up to is the most significant transition in the Arab world since the revolutions of the 1950s. And what they've laid bare is the long-term question of whether an Arab center, as my friend and former Jordanian Foreign Minister Marwan Mawasher has described it, can eventually replace the old order, gradually establishing democratic institutions to manage sectarian differences and provide an outlet for individual dignity, or whether hardliners and extremists of one stripe or another will prove more resilient. The United States has a powerful stake in that very complex competition and in shaping a careful long-term strategy for enhancing the chances for a new moderate order which best protects our interests and reflects our values. If rebalancing has been a central element in American foreign policy under President Obama more generally, it also applies in particular to how we're approaching a rapidly changing Middle East. With the end of the war in Iraq, the U.S. military footprint in the region has become smaller, although it's obvious that our security commitments remain enormously important. Diplomatic and economic tools get greater emphasis, as does the value of applying American leadership to build partnerships with key players inside and outside the region to support positive changes. We need to convey a clear sense of what we stand for, not just what we stand against, an agenda that offers a powerful antidote to extremists who are much better at tearing things down than building anything up. It seems to me that a workable long-term American strategy has 3 interconnected elements: support for democratic change, economic opportunity, and regional peace and security. All 3 are crucial to our broader goal of enhancing the chances that moderates will shape the new regional order more than extremists. All 3 require us to look carefully at where the United States can uniquely make a difference, and at how best to mobilize other countries inside and outside the region in common cause. And all 3 require us to find a sensible course between self-defeating inaction and unsustainable unilateralism. We also have to be honest with ourselves. There will inevitably be some tough trade-offs among these priorities at different moments, and times when it will be hard to weigh the long-term benefits of pushing democratic reforms against short-term security demands. But all three elements have to frame our broader agenda. Let me touch quickly on each of them. Democratic reform can proceed in different ways and at different paces in different places in the region, but there won't be a moderate outcome to the Arab Awakening over the next generation without it. Whether in countries in post-revolutionary transition or countries trying to stay ahead of the wave of change through evolutionary reform, the United States consistently emphasizes a common set of principles: respect for the rule of law, peaceful and inclusive political processes, protecting the fundamental rights of all citizens, including women and minorities and people of all faiths, and steady focus on building strong democratic institutions, real checks and balances, and vibrant civil societies. We try to hold leaders and parties of every political shape to these standards. When it comes to building sustainable democracies, the most consequential distinction is not between Islamists and secularists, but between those who embrace pluralism based on rule of law and those who seek to impose their own vision on others. All parties need to engage in the political process and not sit on the sidelines. Those in power have a special responsibility to make clear that force is no substitute for politics and that a majority is no substitute for dialogue and consensus. And all must condemn and prevent violence, which truly poisons politics. Whether in fragile post-revolutionary states like Tunisia or Egypt, or in monarchies trying to keep pace with their people's expectations like Morocco or Jordan, sustainable democratic change depends on the full participation of all citizens in political and economic life, the belief of all citizens that their peacefully expressed views are heard and respected, and the conviction of all citizens that they share a stake in their country's future. No democratic transition can succeed without a sense of confidence in a better and more inclusive economic future. Unless the Arab Awakening is accompanied by an economic awakening, it will collapse. The hard truth is that most Arab societies have ducked serious economic reform for far too long. Where economic liberalization has occurred, its benefits have often been limited to a privileged few. But serious reform cannot take place in a sustainable manner without basic political consensus on the rules of the game, lest it provoke chaos and instability. That's why inclusive politics and inclusive economic change have to go hand in hand, and why the long-term goal should be societies in which getting ahead depends less on who you know and more on what you know. There is much more that we and other outsiders can do to support long-term economic reform. Even more than conventional assistance, we can use the promise of market access and open trading arrangements to encourage reform and create jobs. We can use initiatives like the new enterprise funds in Egypt and Tunisia to support small and medium-sized enterprises. And we can invest even more actively in helping to renovate educational systems and promote scholarships and exchanges so that the next generation is better equipped to compete and succeed. Those are some of the very best investments in a moderate future for the region that I can imagine. Finally, just as sustainable democratic reform and economic opportunity depend on one another, both depend on a more stable regional environment. I hardly need to tell any of you how hard it will be to make progress on the deepening crisis in Syria, or the Iranian nuclear issue, or the long-stalled Israeli-Palestinian peace process. But these are areas in which American diplomacy and influence can make a difference, and in which we have a profound stake. Our interests and our credibility are at risk on each of them. While I realize that there are lots of other significant security priorities for American policy, from the continuing importance of Iraq's stable evolution, as Ryan Crocker has rightly emphasized recently, to getting ahead of growing terrorist threats in the Maghreb, let me offer a few brief thoughts on Syria, Iran, and the Palestinian-Israeli issue, and I'd be glad to address other challenges in our discussion. The scale and scope of the human tragedy in Syria today is staggering, and it is inexorably becoming a regional tragedy. More than 70,000 Syrians have died. According to the United Nations, 1 out of 3 Syrians will have been forced from their homes by the end of 2013. Jordan is overwhelmed by the burden of 500,000 Syrian refugees, a number which could easily reach 1 million by the end of the year. The crisis in Syria has spilled over to seriously inflamed politics in Iraq and Lebanon. State structures in Syria are crumbling. Extremists are expanding their influence among the opposition, and the dangers of long-term sectarian conflict and fragmentation are growing rapidly. Apparent use of chemical weapons by the Syrian regime is deeply troubling, and we continue to press for a comprehensive UN investigation to fully establish the facts as we consider our options for responding. The simple truth is that there can be no stability in Syria, no resolution of the crisis, without a transition to new leadership. The longer Assad clings to power, the greater the odds of state implosion, fragmentation, and regional spillover. President Obama and Secretary Kerry have made clear that our strong preference remains a negotiated transition. The Geneva framework of last summer offers a reasonable starting point, but Assad refuses to engage. Russia has been resistant, to put it mildly, to using its leverage on the Assad regime. Secretary Kerry's visit to Moscow in a few days is an opportunity to test whether cooperation is possible. We're working intensively with a range of partners to strengthen the Syrian opposition and help shift the balance on the ground, which is essential to any chance of shifting Assad's calculus. The Secretary announced last month that we have doubled non-lethal assistance to the opposition, and the administration is actively considering our other options. There is a mounting urgency to this effort as both the human and the strategic costs grow. I wish I could offer you a neat new prescription this morning, but I cannot. All I can tell you is that we have to work even harder with our allies in the opposition to accelerate Assad's exit while there's still a Syria left to save, and to prepare for what will inevitably be a very difficult day after, more likely, very difficult years after. Whatever decisions we make on further steps in Syria, it is crucial to mobilize as much regional and international support as we can, levering our own actions to help produce a stronger and more inclusive opposition coalition and a stronger and more coordinated set of outside backers. That kind of compact has been the aim of Secretary Kerry's very energetic diplomatic efforts over recent weeks. If we've learned anything from the experience of the last decade, it's that on extraordinarily tough, complex Middle East problems like Syria, we want to build as much shared purpose and responsibility as we can. We should want company on the takeoff because we will all need it for the landing in the huge challenge of post-Assad Syria. On Iran, let me say simply that our concerns are profound and they extend beyond the nuclear issue, across a range of dangerous Iranian behavior that threatens our interests and those of our friends in the region, and to the Iranian regime's denial of the human rights of its citizens. The president has emphasized since his first days in office our readiness, along with our P5+1 partners, to seek a negotiated resolution of the Iranian nuclear problem. That shouldn't be impossible. If Iran is serious about meeting its international obligations and demonstrating through concrete steps the exclusively peaceful nature of its nuclear ambitions. Unfortunately, Iran has been stubbornly unwilling, so far, to seriously address international concerns and has given rise to new ones with its steady, defiant expansion of its nuclear program in direct violation of numerous United Nations Security Council and IAEA decisions. At recent meetings in Almaty, the P5+1 put a reasonable, reciprocal confidence-building proposal on the table, aimed at beginning to create some sense of trust and allow time and space for negotiation of a more comprehensive arrangement. Unfortunately, Iran's response gave no indication that it is willing to take meaningful steps to address international concerns. There is still time for diplomacy, and we and our partners hope Iran will take advantage of it. But there is also increasing urgency on this issue, too. The president has made very clear that he will do whatever it takes to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. We and our partners have put in place an unprecedented set of sanctions, which have had a significant and growing impact on Iran's economy. I continue to hope that serious diplomacy is still possible, Too many opportunities have been missed before, including the abortive fall 2009 deal on the Tehran research reactor, in which I played a direct part. It would be a huge miscalculation for Iran to miss this one too. On the Palestinian issue, I'm convinced that the status quo between Palestinians and Israelis is as unsteady, unsustainable, and combustible as the sclerotic political systems that have crumbled elsewhere in the region over the past couple years. I have never been a big believer in the notion that we have to let the conflict ripen to the point that resolution seems more likely. I'm afraid the more likely effect of that approach is to watch the prospects for a two-state solution, which is so deeply in the interests of Israel's long-term security, as well as the interests of the Palestinians in the region, wither and die on the vine. President Obama underscored in Jerusalem earlier this spring his belief that progress toward Middle East peace is necessary, just, and possible. In only a few months in office, Secretary Kerry has been tireless in his efforts to find a path back to serious negotiations, a path that blends a renewed political horizon for a two-state solution with steps to create an encouraging economic horizon for Palestinians and a renewed focus on the decade-old promise of the Arab Peace Initiative, which the Secretary discussed with a visiting group of Arab foreign ministers last Monday in Washington. None of this will be easy. It never has been. Former Secretary of State Jim Baker, a proud Princeton graduate, keeps a whole wall of caustic newspaper cartoons outside his office in Houston, which reflected the skepticism surrounding his 9 trips to the Middle East before the Madrid Peace Conference in 1991. But he proved his doubters wrong, and American diplomacy worked. The landscape today is in many ways much less promising, but as Secretary Kerry knows as well as anyone, this is not an argument against trying, given all that is at stake. I suspect I'm now perilously close to violating George Bernard Shaw's 20-minute rule for brevity in public speaking, so I'll close with a simple thought. I'm not naive about the Middle East, or how little we really know about where this period of profound change will take the region and its people. The story that is unfolding is also very much a story of Arab peoples taking their own destiny in their own hands, which should provide a cautionary note about the degree to which we can help shape their futures. The Middle East can be very unforgiving for American policymakers and diplomats, and it would be foolish to assume the best. We've had our share of recent tragedies, including the death of our friend Chris Stevens, our ambassador in Libya, who was killed trying to help Libyans realize the promise of their revolution and not let it be hijacked by extremists. But we cannot afford to pull back from the region, whether because of security risks or rebalanced priorities or policy fatigue or domestic preoccupations. There's too much at issue right now, and we can increase the odds that moderates across the region can succeed over the next decade or two if we engage actively and creatively on behalf of democratic change, economic opportunity, and regional peace and security. We will not get every judgment right or take every risk that we should, but we are far better off working persistently to help shape events rather than wait for them to be shaped for us. Thank you very much. Sure.
The Deputy Secretary has agreed to answer some questions. If you can make it to the 2 mics, please do, and he will try to go back and forth. If you can't make it to the mic, speak up, and then he'll repeat the question before answering it. So you're invited to pose your questions.
If I haven't stunned you all into silence at this hour of a Saturday morning, so thanks. Yes, sir.
Mr. Secretary, my name is John Thompson. I was an MPA graduate about 50 years ago and a retired senior foreign service officer.
Nice
I didn't make it to the top like you and Ambassador Crocker, but I did spend an interesting 11 years at NATO coordinating the infrastructure program that I modestly say single-handedly won the Cold War. But more, more to the point,
Lots of people are taking credit for that, but yeah.
more to the point, earlier in my career, I spent a year in the Operations Center, which, as you know, is responsible for notifying people in the department, principals such as yourself, what's going on. I took a call from political counselor in Saigon after the embassy compound had been overrun, and in real time advised people in the department and also people at the Pentagon whose coordination with MACV had broken down on what was going on there. And so I know how things are reported in real time. I also had a call directly from LBJ who wanted to know when the Pueblo was attacked. It's in the middle of the night. He called up to find out. So I was distressed, as many Americans, even before the whole political aspect arose, about the way that Benghazi was handled. And later on, with the study, which apparently did not interview the secretary, who I can't imagine was not immediately notified of what was going on. And later on, more recently, where the president is saying that he can't imagine that any government employee would be stopped from speaking out to the Congress. And where the State Department spokesman is saying, well, we don't think these people, it's really proper for them to speak to the Congress. It distresses me. I think it distresses a lot of Americans and those in the press who are interested in looking into this. And so I'd appreciate your comments on that whole business, please.
Sure, I'd be glad to. And first, thank you very much for your service in the State Department over the years. On Benghazi, I mean, just to get set a few things straight. I mean, as Secretary Kerry has made clear, the State Department will continue to cooperate fully. It's in our interest to get all the facts out, difficult as some of them are, and I can assure you that nobody is going to be prevented from speaking out, whether it's to the Congress or anyone else. We're committed to, the fullest transparency that can be provided here, and that's been the premise of our efforts ever since that terrible tragedy occurred, and that's exactly what Secretary Clinton insisted on, and that's what Secretary Kerry will continue to insist upon. The truth is, we learned the hard way that we have to do some things better. I thought the Accountability Review Board that was led by former colleague of yours, Tom Pickering, as well as Admiral Mike Mullen, did a thorough and fair job of trying to get to the bottom of an extremely difficult issue. And we're going to learn from those lessons and improve where we need to, because there can't be a higher priority than ensuring the safety and security of our people overseas, while at the same time, as I said in my opening remarks, continuing to do what needs to be done for the sake of American interests in a very important part of the world. And that means that we have to continue to engage, not just with governments across the region, but with people, sometimes in some very difficult and dangerous circumstances. And it's a credit to all of our colleagues who, as we speak today here in Princeton, are serving across the Middle East in some very tough posts, that they're continuing to do that. So thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Ambassador, I'm Thanasi Kambanis from the Century Foundation.
Hi.
I've spent most of the last 10 years in the Arab world, and I'm curious how much influence you feel like we have today compared to how much we used to have. And there's a lot of hand-wringing and also just questioning about how much can we affect what goes on there, and particularly with Egypt and Israel-Palestine, but also just larger. Not so much a question of is our influence eclipsed, but rather what tools do we have left and what real levers for affecting behavior in the region?
Sure. Well, it's a very good question. I mean, I think obviously the landscape has changed a lot. If you compare the landscape and American influence to what was the case 2 decades ago, when, as you know, Secretary Baker, under the leadership of President Bush, helped take advantage of opportunities at the end of the first Gulf War and put together the Madrid Peace Conference. That was a period where the United States and the world was, I think, unchallenged in many respects in terms of our primacy, and where our influence was respected across the Middle East in some important ways. And so the landscape is different now, but I think we have to be realistic about the limits of our influence. I don't think that should be a rationalization for passivity, because I think there are things that we can do. As I said, you're not going to see successful political transitions across the Arab world without an increase in economic opportunity. We've tended over the years to fixate on conventional assistance programs. I've been convinced for a long time that there's more we can do to open up trading arrangements of the sort that we've seen with bilateral free trade agreements when I was ambassador in Jordan, or in bigger countries around the region. So I think there's more that we can do there. I think we can make a difference on even some of the most difficult regional issues, whether it's the Palestinian-Israeli conflict or some of the other challenges to regional stability, because there's no chance in which some of those transitions, whether political or economic, are going to succeed unless you have a more stable regional environment. And that's the place where I think the United States can make a difference. We can't dictate events, but we can make a difference. And that has a direct, I think, constructive effect on the chances that those transitions might succeed too. Thanks. Sorry. Hi.
Hi, thank you. My name is Corey Conrad. I'm
Hi.
MPA 2005. Curious to hear your perspective on the role of technology, particularly in light of Arab Spring, Wael Ghonim use of Facebook in Egypt, Twitter, text-to-tweet, getting information in and out of countries, and just how things have changed recently, and the role of technology.
Well, I mean, it's changed not only the landscape, I think, across the Middle East, but also the way we do business as diplomats as well. And certainly in Tahrir Square, 2.5 years ago, you saw the impact of that, the way in which, youth activists and youth leaders who, had a lot of difficulty connecting with one another before could mobilize. You see it in the way in which people and societies across that region are far more aware now than they were before of what others have that they don't. And so the kind of demonstration effect of, what happened in Tunisia and then how its spread was accelerated by information technology across the region. You also see its limits, though, too, because information technology, as you know very well, is a kind of neutral instrument. There are lots of people who can take advantage of it, including violent extremists. There are limits to it as well in the sense that it's easier to use new media to organize demonstrations than it is to form political parties and undertake the very hard business of organizing politically, competing in elections over the long term. And that requires a very determined effort that's been difficult, in truth, for a lot of secular oppositionists in Egypt and in other parts of the Arab world. So it's an enormously important new tool. We as diplomats have to take advantage of it more. Not that every embassy in the world needs to be tweeting every 20 minutes, because there are limits to that as well. But to take advantage of that, to connect with people and parts of societies who were remote from us in the past, whom we can connect to now, and that's extremely important. So we have a lot to learn as well in terms of how we conduct our diplomacy too, and how we can best take advantage of those technologies. Hi.
Yeah,
Tom.
hi. Welcome back to Princeton, and thanks for your service. I'm Tom Kristensen. I teach here. I'm a China specialist, as you know, and served in the State Department. Worked more closely with your predecessor, Nick Burns, as undersecretary. I want you to help me answer my Chinese colleagues and my Russian colleagues when they criticize our policies in the region. And the arguments that I hear on a regular basis, and I have to wrestle with and have difficulty answering, is what incentives does someone like Assad have to negotiate any kind of agreement with the United States when at the beginning of the crisis we call for his ouster? He must go. And then we say, now we want to negotiate. When we negotiate with Iran, how can we convince them that it's a good idea for them to give up their nuclear programs when Gaddafi gave up his and we took him out? And then finally, how do we get Russia and China to agree to international intervention in these affairs of other states on the pretense of trying to get a negotiated settlement when we took out Gaddafi in Libya? Those are the issues that they raise on a regular basis. I come up with my own answers. I don't think that that's what's driving Iranian behavior. I don't think that's what's driving North Korean behavior. But it's in those contexts that they raise those questions. Yeah. And I'm hoping that someone with a lot more experience than I, like you, would have a better answer than I can provide. So.
Yeah, wish. Good question, and I doubt that I'm going to shed a whole lot of light on those, although neither the Russians nor the Chinese are ever bashful, as you know, about raising those questions directly with serving American government officials, too. Neither the Russians nor the Chinese are generally very sentimental about the kind of judgments that get made on some of the issues that you mentioned. I don't think there's anything inconsistent with the judgment that President Obama and many others around the world expressed relatively early on in the Syria crisis about what it would take to see a stability in Syria, recognizing what's at stake. It's not just the horrible human cost for individual Syrian human beings, it's the spillover effect as well in a region that already has more than its share of troubles. The judgment the president reached was that whereas it was possible in the first few months of the revolution that began to emerge in Syria for Assad to reform his way out of the problem, he chose to try to shoot his way out. And that proved disastrous for Syria and for the legitimacy of his rule. So the judgment the president made was that there was simply no way that he was going to be able to sustain himself in power and preserve a stable Syria and avoid the terrible dangers of spillover that we're seeing today. That explained our commitment and the commitment of many others in the international community to a negotiated transition of leadership. And this isn't a negotiation in a vacuum. It's a negotiation aimed at producing a transition. And that's what the Russians subscribed to in the Geneva framework that I mentioned before. And so I think the challenge and the conversations we have with Russia and China, for example, over Syria, is, let's look at the realities right now in Syria. You have a horrible human catastrophe that's beginning to spill over in very dangerous ways in the region that can help create a platform for violent extremists, violent Islamists, the Nusra Front and others in Syria who can feed instability in lots of places that matter to Russia, for example, like the North Caucasus. And it shouldn't be objectively in their interest, our interest, for this to continue. Therefore, there ought to be a shared interest in trying to find a way to produce a negotiated transition. That requires all of us using our influence to try to, produce that kind of a possibility. Obviously, much easier said than done. Same is true on the Iranian nuclear issue. I mean, the issue here has never been whether or not Iran can have a peaceful nuclear program. The issue has been whether it's prepared to demonstrate through concrete actions that it'll live up to its international obligations after years in which its actions have run precisely in the opposite direction. And I think there's a shared interest with Russia and China in trying to use what influence they have, what influence we have, to produce circumstances in which that might be possible. So sorry to go on so long. It's a very good question, though. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Charles Dunbar. I spent 32 years ago. Nice
Very
to see
nice
you.
to see you.
32 years ago, I spent a happy year on the shores of Lake Carnegie, so I'm glad to be back. Your presence in the corridors of power gives me hope, and there isn't a lot of ground for hope these days. You're an inspiration. That said, very quick question. Do you think that there is a role for the United Nations to play, perhaps even a central role, in a peace operation with Lakhdar Brahimi, a man I admire very much, at its head in Syria, since I'm afraid that the answer to that question will be diplomatic, but perhaps short? What about Jamal Ben Omar and Yemen? Thank you.
Well, I think, Charlie, it's nice to see you, and thanks again for your service in a part of the world that you know as well as anyone. Certainly I think, as deeply frustrating as it has been for Lakhdar Brahimi, who's been the UN Secretary General's envoy on Syria issues for the last year, I still think that there's a role potentially for Brahimi, who's, as you know, an extremely skilled diplomat. He, on 3 different occasions, my Russian counterpart and I have met with Brahimi to try to see if we couldn't find some common ground to bring to life this Geneva framework. And despite his best efforts, we haven't been able to bridge the gaps which remain between us. But I think there's still potentially a role there. Unfortunately, as I said before, in Syria, and I say this unfortunately, I think the balance on the ground is going to have to shift more significantly before, whether it's Assad himself or some of those around him in the Syrian regime. Again, well, post-Assad, then I think there's clearly a role for the UN, and there's going to be a role for lots of people, because the challenge of post-Assad Syria is going to be an enormous one. In terms of the humanitarian challenge of displaced people, both within Syria itself and outside its borders, the reconstruction, not only of the economy, but of political institutions, and not least security. So I think the UN is not going to be able to do all of it on its own, obviously, but I think there's going to be a valuable role to play. And I think Jamal Ben Omar has played a very useful role in Yemen. I think, many of you in this room know Yemen better than I do, but if someone had predicted to me that Yemen's political evolution would have proceeded, and Barbara knows this extremely well, as sort of fitfully and incrementally, but mostly in a better direction 3 years ago, and that Yemen would look like a relative success story compared to some other Arab societies. I suppose that tells you more about other Arab societies and their evolution than Yemen. But I think the UN has played a helpful role there, along with some very good American ambassadors. Thanks. Hi.
My name is Carl Meyer, class of '53.
Hi.
And a retired journalist and independent author. A question I'd like to ask is, what do you say to people that the United States really doesn't live up to the very principles that it's advocating in the Middle East? The use of violence, we have drones with kill lists, honesty and clarity in government. We now know that Karzai was monthly getting bags of cash from the CIA. Rule of law, Guantanamo, where we have prisoners who've been there for 10 years without any hope of release. We're now on a hunger strike. I recognize these are difficult problems, but I'm curious how you respond when someone puts them up to you.
Well, to start by stating the obvious, we're not perfect, but we try as best we can, administration after administration, I think, to understand what's transpiring across the Middle East, just to focus on that first, and to try as best we can to apply principle as well as interest to the policy frameworks that we use. President's made clear on Guantanamo his deep interest in closing it as fast as we can. I think he, like lots of other people, are frustrated that it's taken so long. And I think, in dealing with all the challenges that I was talking about and that you know very well across the region, we're going to have to strike the very best balance that we can between standing up for principles that not only matter to the United States, but are in the long-term self-interest of societies across that region. It's not easy sometimes for us to speak out in favor of universal human rights. There's sometimes a collision between our interest in speaking out for those rights and pushing for democratic reforms and security imperatives. You see that in the real-world challenge of making policy in a place like Bahrain today. But there's no escaping, those kind of difficult choices and trade-offs in making policy or in trying to carry it out. And I think, we have to keep all of those different elements in balance as best we can. We're not going to always get it right, but I think it's very important for us not to neglect principle at the expense of short-term interest. Because ultimately what happens, and we've seen it, of course, the last 2.5 years in the Arab world, is that societies that aren't paying attention to those kind of changes to meet the needs of their citizens do become brittle and break, and that creates its own set of huge security challenges for us. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Deputy Secretary Burns.